It's the middle of the night and you wake up with a start. Suddenly, you have the answer to a question that has been just bothering you and nagging at you for hours. This might have been a question that was posed earlier in the day, or something that somebody asked you and you knew the answer, but you couldn't quite get it out. You couldn't quite grasp it in the moment that it was asked. It might just be a question that you heard somebody else ask that had nothing to do with anything that you were engaged in, but suddenly you just couldn't stop thinking about what the answer was to that question. It might even be something that you weren't aware you were thinking about, something that was said or presented at some point in your conversations during the day, and you went to bed, you forgot about it, but suddenly in the middle of the night, for me, it's usually around 3 or 4 a.m., you wake up because the answer suddenly popped in your brain. Has that ever happened to you? Well, that happens because our brains have certain things that activate them in such a way that we can just not let them go. It is impossible for our brains to just forget about them, let them go, and move on with whatever else it is that we want to concentrate on. And even though we might not be consciously thinking about them, they continue to work in our subconscious or our unconscious level as we're doing all these other things. And very often while we're sleeping, they resurface and we become conscious of them again. So the reason I mention this is because we can actually tap into some of those ways in which our brain works in such a way that we connect with our audiences, engage them, and pull them in to such an extent that they will continue to, even at a subconscious or unconscious level, think about what we've shared with them well beyond our time together. So as we wrap up our series on the ABCs of public speaking, today we're going to look at QRS, and we are going to talk about some of the most powerful subliminal, quote unquote, tools that we have to tap into our audience's brains. Let's get started. Like I mentioned, today is all about figuring out how our presentations can have a lasting impact in our audience's minds and in our audience's brains. Now, I'm not going to get really deep into the neuroscience and the linguistic science of it all, but there are certain things that we can do that will not just make our interactions and our presentations be more engaging, more entertaining, and draw our audiences in while we are presenting. But they are also things that are going to instill something in our audience's brains that will continue to work well beyond the ending of our presentation, so that days, weeks, months after our presentation, they will still be working in our audience's brains, what we're going to instill and what we're going to use. So we are going to be talking about some techniques that we need to be really conscious and really careful about. And the reason I say this is because all the elements of persuasion, all the elements of positive influence can also be used for evil, so to speak, right? So they can also be used in a manipulative or gaslighty way. I want to caution us that as we get good at some of these skills that we're going to be talking about today, we will have the ability to manipulate people, especially if we're talking to people who are younger than us, or people who admire us, or who see us as authoritative or influential. These skills that we're going to talk about today have the potential to be used for evil instead of good, to be used as manipulation tools instead of tools to connect and engage and to help people move forward. So the caution is this: these techniques work, but be careful of your intention in using them, because it is never a good idea to use these skills to gain an upper hand in talking to people or in trying to persuade people. When you use these skills for your own gain, for your own purposes, thinking only about yourself and not about the other person, I will caution you that sooner or later, you will see the consequences of doing that to other people. So make sure that while you work on these skills, you have the best of intentions at heart, that you're thinking about how you're going to support and help the other person through this process, and not how to use it so that you can gain the advantage or the upper hand. And we will talk a lot more about why that distinction is so important when we get to the R. But for now, just know that what we are going to be talking about is extremely powerful. It does work, and that I recommend highly that if your intention is to use it for your own gains and for your own purposes rather than for something that could be a win for everybody involved, then just don't. You will see eventually that it comes back to bite you where you don't want to be bitten. So make sure that you are using this for the best, highest possible purposes that you can think of, and not for a basal momentary gain type of situation. Clear? Good? We on the same page? Awesome. So we are going to be talking about Q, R, and S today, and we are going to wrap up our ABCs of Public Speaking series with these 3 letters. Q, we're going to be talking about questions. R, we're going to be talking about rapport. And S, we're going to be talking about stories. And yes, I have mentioned stories before, but when we get to that part, you're going to see why it is worth spending a few more minutes on it today. We ready? So let's start with Q. Q, like I said, starts with questions. Now, have you ever wondered why so many videos and posts begin with, "Have you ever wondered?" or some form of a question? The reason is because our brains are hardwired to search for the answers to questions that are presented. Remember my scenario at the beginning of the podcast today about waking up in the middle of the night with the answer to a question that was presented maybe hours, even days before? That is because our brains are the ultimate search engines. And once a question is presented, they will not rest until they find an answer to the question. Now, notice I said an answer. It's not necessarily that you're going to find the definitive, correct, factual answer, even if the answer to a question is a fact. But there will be an answer that will be presented by your brain at some point or another. The thing is, our brains operate at 4 different levels, and we don't have to get into all of that. But the conscious and the preconscious level, those we know about, right? But then the unconscious and the subconscious, that is where things are just a dark mass of things that we don't quite understand and that we are not aware of. And the more we can bring awareness to those things, the more we can understand our own brains and use them for greater purposes, right? And questions are one of those things that we seldom understand. But our brains operate very, very frequently based on questions, even when we are operating at the self-talk level, right? When we're talking to ourselves, nobody else can hear it. It's that chatter in our brain, that conversation. Most of the time, that conversation happens in some form of questioning because our brains operate, like I said, just like a search engine. So you present a question or an issue or a problem, and the brain goes to work in figuring out an answer to it, and it will not rest until it gives you an answer. So when you think about your day, you wake up, and sometime in the first few minutes after waking up, there are questions that are going to start happening. What day is it? What do I have for today? What am I wearing? Am I getting up right now, or am I hitting the snooze button? Is it going to rain? What's the weather like? How many emails did I just receive? Right? So within seconds, usually, of awareness, of waking up, we start asking ourselves all these questions, and our brains will go to work to start providing answers for those questions. And as we operate throughout the day, if we become really conscious of what we're telling ourselves, of what's happening in here, in between our ears, we will understand that a lot of the communication we have with ourselves happens in the form of questions, because that is the most powerful way for our brains to engage in whatever it is that we are about to do or doing. Same thing happens when you are in the middle of a presentation. And again, for our conversation, For the purposes of this conversation, a presentation or public speaking is not just when you're standing in front of a group of people or when you have a virtual audience of a bunch of people. A presentation can be a one-on-one conversation as long as there is a back and forth interaction and you have a message to deliver, that you have a reason for wanting the other person to understand your message, right? So as long as you're deliberately and intentionally trying to present a message, hoping that the other person will understand and engage with your message and maybe do something as a result of your message, that counts as public speaking as far as our conversation goes, right? So when we're engaging in any kind of communication of that nature, where we are trying to present a message, we're trying to make sure the other person gets the right meaning from our message that we're presenting, and we are hoping that at the end the other person will either understand where we're coming from and or engage in some way, then we're having a public speaking conversation, right? And so whenever we're doing this, questions become ultra important. Do you know why? Because once a question is presented, our brains will go to work in finding and providing an answer. Now, the easiest way for your brain to get satisfaction for that answer is if you give the answer right after the question, right? So like I just said, do you know why? I waited a second and then I gave you the answer. Now your brain is no longer searching for that answer because I gave it to you. But if you want your audience to really pay attention to what you are about to say, the most effective way to do so is to present a question and leave it open for the moment and come back to it later on. So can you see how asking a question at the beginning, like I said, have you ever wondered, right, at the beginning, or what is the most effective way to engage your audience? Asking a question and then going into some of the other elements, talking through maybe your points, talking through some of the other elements that you have to bring, and then circling back to the answer is going to keep your audience engaged, because the entire time you're talking, they are waiting for the answer to that question you first posted. Does that make sense? Now, that is one thing. So if you can think of a question that you can present at the beginning of your interaction or your presentation that you can leave open without it sounding like you're leaving this huge gap, and making a connection to a story or some of the other elements that we're going to talk about, and then come back to it at the end, you're going to leave your audience engaged the entire time you're talking, because they're just focused on looking for that answer. Are you going to answer this question for me, or do I have to keep thinking about what the answer might be? It might even happen that they think they know the answer and they're just waiting for validation or for confirmation on the answer that they came up with. So I could ask, for example, what is the biggest need? What is the greatest need that all human beings have? And how can we provide for that need in our presentations? And guess what? We're going to now go into letter R. And as we look at letter R, which is rapport, we're going to be looking at the key ways in which we can actually satisfy that greatest need that all human beings have, really, and that it should be at the forefront of everything that we do in our presentations. When we are engaging in trying to build rapport, we are trying to make sure that the other person or the people involved in the conversation that is public speaking feel like they have a place in the conversation. When we are looking to build rapport, even if we're standing on a stage in front of thousands of people, the point, the purpose, the ultimate goal in building rapport is to make it feel to them like we are having a one-on-one conversation and like they are part of that conversation. When we're building rapport, we're building this connection that allows us to go back and forth in a way that feels familiar and that feels like we are truly engaging with the other person or people, and that they feel drawn into and pulled into the conversation and like they're part of the interaction. They're just not sitting there placidly listening, or passively, I should have said, sorry, listening, but they're actively engaged in what is happening in the conversation. Now, there are a couple of keys to building rapport. I'm going to focus on two. The first key to building rapport is to be interested in them more than you are interested in them liking you or reacting to you or whatever their impression might be of you. So the first key in building rapport is to be outward focused, to be focused on the other people rather than on yourself. Even if you're talking to an audience of 2, 3, 4,000, you can use questions, which we talked about before, to draw them in. So you can ask things like, okay, who here in my audience or who here sitting in this space has ever experienced whatever it might be, and ask them to raise their hand. Or let me see who I'm talking to here. How many of you here are moms or dads, parents of any kind? And you ask them to raise their hand, right? You can engage in building that connection by having them actively do things like standing or sitting or breathing or reading or whatever it is that will connect them to what comes next in your presentation, right? So being more interested in connecting with them and in having them be part of the conversation rather than having them be interested in you is the first key to building rapport. So what a lot of speakers do, and this has been something that I've talked about before, but I think it bears repeating, something that a lot of speakers do that was actually taught in the past with great intentions, but that doesn't really help in building rapport, is talking so much about their credibility, their authority, and their expertise that they create a gap between themselves and the audience. So you've seen this happen a lot, right? So a speaker gets on the stage and they're like, well, let me tell you a little bit about why you should listen to me. If you have to tell me why I should listen to you, I immediately lose interest, first of all. And that might just be me, but I doubt it. How many of you out there, when the person starts going, here's why you should listen to me, you kind of block them and you stop listening, right? I know it's not just me. But even if you're not the kind of person that is put off by that kind of a comment, when the person starts going through all their credentials, all their credibility, all the reasons why you should listen to them, what it makes it feel like for me and for a lot of the people I talk to, it's like they are on this pedestal, they're on this level that I could never reach. And what that does is actually make me feel like there's no point in sitting through 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 minutes of listening to them, because I will never be able to reach the level that they're at unless I go and I get the licensing or the credibility or go through the same things that they went through. Does that make sense? So when you are trying to build rapport, the more you focus on them, the less you have to worry even about building that credibility. Because think about it. If I stand here and I say to you, speaking in front of others is difficult as heck. It will make you nervous. It will make you sweat. It will make your knees just click against each other. It will make you rattle from head to toe. And you will feel from time to time like you have no business standing there in front of the other people, like you are a fraud and like there's no reason why anybody should listen to you. You will feel the fear, you will feel the doubt, but as you engage with your audience and as you build rapport with your audience, those feelings will lessen because you will be so focused on them that nothing will matter more than making sure they get what they need, right? Now, what I just did, if you've ever experienced those feelings of being in front of an audience and being nervous and everything shaking and rattling and all of that, it just gave me instant authority, because now you're thinking, wait, she knows what she's talking about because she knows how I felt. And I'm focusing on you, not on me. But the more I can relate to my audience, the more I can show to them that I understand where they're at, where they're coming from, the more you can put yourself in their shoes and show them that you know what they're experiencing and what it's like, and that you have felt it too, the more they're going to see you as an authority and as a credibility source, as a source of credibility, because they will understand that you've been where they're at. They will understand that you're not just talking out of reading a book or out of what you heard somebody else say. They will understand that you understand them, right? And the second thing you can do to build rapport is to focus on goodwill. Focus on making sure that you want what's the absolute best for the person or people in front of you. The easiest way to do that, well, there's two tools that I use. The first one is imagine that all of them are your kids or your best friend, right? If you have children, think of them as your kids. If your kids were sitting in the audience, what would you tell them? What would you give them? What would you want them to receive? How would you want them to be treated? What kind of verbiage would you use and how would you come across if your kids were the ones sitting there listening to you? What would you say? What would you not say if your kids were sitting there listening to you? If you don't have kids, or if you don't think it's appropriate because of the context or the topic that you're covering, then your best friend. If it was your best friend, your spouse, sitting there in the audience, getting the information that you're delivering, what would you want them to think? What would you want them to get? What would you want them to hear? And speak in such a way that would allow your best friend, your spouse, your ideal client, the person that you care about the most, sitting there in the audience, to get benefit and growth and value out of what you're delivering. So if you can do that, if you can bring your attention to how do I support these people because I want the absolute best for them, then you have created goodwill, and that will build instant rapport, right? Because do you know what the greatest need for human beings are? For human beings is the greatest need for human beings is to be felt, seen, and understood. See what I did there? I had asked that question before I started talking about VR, but now I'm answering it. And if you build rapport the right way, you are allowing your audience to feel seen, heard, and understood, because you are developing this goodwill, because you're focusing on them, because your main concern is their well-being. And therefore, they will feel like you see them, hear them, and understand them. And that will build instant rapport, and it will totally and completely fulfill that need that they have to be seen, heard, and understood, right? So again, the cue was asking questions. And that is important because it activates the brain in a way that nothing else can. And the second is building rapport, which you do by activating your focus on them and your desire to see them well, right? Goodwill, to see them succeed, to see them have a gain, to see them move forward as a result of their interaction with you. And then finally, the S is stories. Now, we've talked about stories a lot, and there's a lot of people out there that talk about stories. So I'm not going to focus too long on stories, but we do know that we are hardwired for stories. Once we start hearing something that might sound like a story, our ears perk up, we get all excited, we get all interested, and we really want to know what the end of the story might be. We really want to understand what happens and why is it important. We immediately look for who is it that we can relate to within the story, that we see them very similar to ourselves. Very recently, my 13-year-old was asked to read the novel The Outsiders by S.E. Hinton in school. And it was really interesting because my 13-year-old is not particularly fond of reading. She will read if she has to, but she doesn't love it. She is more about visuals, like art, right? So she paints and she draws and she does knitting and she does all these things that are manual and visual, more plastic arts type thing. Like she's even into sculpting with different mediums and stuff. So she's very much that type of an artist, but not really into books and reading. And I know that part of it is just the fact that letters are not aesthetically pleasing, right? They're just black and white sitting there. They don't do much of anything. So it doesn't interest her too much. But anyway, the point is she was asked to read The Outsiders for school. And I had told her, you're going to love The Outsiders. You're totally and completely going to get into this novel if you allow yourself to. So she starts reading it. And a day or two later, she comes home and she goes, Mom, I don't believe this, but I'm actually enjoying this book. And I said, see, told you so. Just listen to Mom every once in a while. No, that's not what I said. I said, really? And can I ask you why? Can you guess why? Because she was immediately able to identify with one of the characters in the novel. Like within the first few pages, she saw herself in one of the characters. And then the story took a different meaning to her, because every time she read what that character was going through, she was waiting to see how that character came out on the other end. She was waiting to see if there was hope for her based on what that character had gone through. She was waiting to see just how similar they were. And also at a certain level, she was waiting to see in what way she was better than he is, than the character is, right? And so we do these things with stories where we relate to a character. We're looking to see how we can connect personally and deeply with the story, because that's part of what makes stories so important, culturally speaking and socially speaking. We learn vicariously through the characters in the stories. We look for answers. We look for hope. We look for direction. And we look for ways in which we can live a better life because we have seen how this character experienced life, or how this character went through something similar than what we went through, right? And so stories are not just important because of the way that they activate our brain centers, right? Like, I don't know if you know this, and again, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but when we're reading, when we are really into our reading, the same area of the brain that is activated during dreaming is activated. So we're daydreaming while we're reading. We are actually daydreaming a lot of our day, except when we are engaged in a story in some way, either reading it or listening to it, because then the story does the daydreaming for us. And daydreaming, as much as it gets a bad rap, is very, very important. Now, here's one thing I will say about the power of story when it comes to public speaking, because it's an error that I see a lot of people make a lot of the time. When you are selecting the stories to tell, there's a time and a place for different types of stories, and we don't have time to dive deeply into this. I might have another podcast just focused on the different types of stories and how we apply them. But here's the biggest mistake that I see people make in presentations. We select stories where the speaker, we, are the hero, right? And we talk about our journey and how we came out at the other end, hoping that in the process, the audience will identify with us, with our journey, and with the way we emerged at the other side, and that they will want to do what it is that we do, or follow the path that we followed, right? So very often I hear, especially entrepreneurs and business owners, talk about the hero's journey and how to incorporate it in the story, and they make themselves the hero, hoping that the audience will be prompted to replace us with them and identify with us and the way we traveled through our journey. Now, there's a time and a place for that, and it's usually very limited and very much at the beginning of our interaction. But the problem with following that train of thought and using that every time we tell a story is that then the focus goes back onto us and away from the audience. And the focus being on us makes us separate, creates a gap, like we were talking about before, between us and the audience. So the right way to think about it, and Donald Miller talks a lot about this, the right way to think about it is we're not the hero, we're the guide. The audience is the hero. So we're trying to pull them into the story. And it might be something that you've been through, which is why you can relate to them and which is why you can guide them. But as much as possible, make them be the ones in the story, or make it in such a way that you draw them in and ask them if they have experienced that type of experience before, and put them in the hero's place and not yourself. You are the guide that moves them forward, right? So when you think about it, what story can you tell That even though it's a story that maybe you experienced or that maybe you heard from someone else, you can invite the audience to take the place of the hero. So when someone starts a business, for example, it is very difficult to see yourself as the hero that people, or as the guide that people can follow, right? So it's a lot easier for you to see yourself in the hero's place. But what part of that story of you as the hero can the audience most relate to? And can you switch the pronoun so that they can see themselves in the story instead of seeing you in the story? So when you tell the story about how you had this incredible vision, but you were unsure about how to follow it, can you draw them in and ask them, have you ever experienced knowing that you have a mission, knowing that you have a purpose, knowing that there's this great thing that you get to do and accomplish, but not having a clue how to move forward? Well, then come here, because you're the hero, and let me walk you through what you can do next. Does that make sense? So you're looking to place them in the role of the hero. They are casted as the heroes. You're casted as the guide, even though sometime in the past you were the hero in the story. Make sense? All right. So again, the Q, R, and S have some tools that are going to help you draw people in such a way that they will be captivated by what you're saying and be just waiting desperately for you to get to the conclusion of your story. So they will be glued to what you're saying so that they can get the answers and so that they can see the end results and so they can see themselves walking the journey and getting to the end. And those last three things that we're going to be that we talked about are questions, rapport, and stories. If you use these tools effectively, you will draw your audience in such a way that they will not want to leave until what you have to say is finished, and they will be fully focused on what you're presenting, what you're saying, and how you're saying it. I really hope that this ABCs of Public Speaking series has been helpful for you. If it has, share it with someone who might find value in it. And if in the process of sharing the ABCs, I left something out that you're really curious about, or I did not go deeply into something that you would like to hear more about, make sure and let me know. Write it in the comments or send me a note at marcy@marcyamaro.com, and I'll be more than happy to create an episode that addresses your questions. In the meantime, head on over to marcyamaro.com to schedule time for us to chat about your message, about your vision, about how to share it with the world, how to present effectively, and how to start your own show, and the next steps that you should be taking in order for your messaging to reach the people that you are meant to reach. You have a powerful, amazing message. So go out there and speak confidently, live boldly, and lead with passion. Until next time, this has been Marcy Amaro, and this has been Sincerely Speaking.